Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm Jeff Howe, joined by CJ Vogel and Rod Babers, continuing our position breakdowns, our pre-spring position breakdowns, wrapping up the offense with a look at the tight ends. And Rod, before we started recording, I think you kind of laid out the theme for this position group. Not really what sure to expect from the tight ends. Jack Injuries is gone. You bring in Michael Masunas as an inline blocker. We'll see where Nick Townsend's development goes. Jordan Washington at the transfer portal. What is the state of the tight ends, Rod? The 30,000-foot view of this position right now.
You know, it's interesting because going into last year, you also didn't have a lot of playing experience and not a lot of targets coming back at tight end. And now with Jack Injuries gone and other guys leaving, that's also the case again. You don't have many targets coming back at tight end. Nick Townsend, of course, Nick Townsend have 3 targets last season. Emery Winston had like 3 targets last season as well. I do ran Michael Masunas via the transfer portal, but I see his asset, if you will, is as a blocker. And that's what they're bringing him in for. Now, who knows? He may end up being a plus for you in the pass game as well. But the problem for Texas at tight end just during Sark's tenure, and Sark is the one that said tight end, second most important position in his offense behind quarterback, is that they have not had an all-around tight end that is not only a threat in the passing game, but also can be a mauler blocking in the run game and a high-level pass blocker. And now that's a lot to ask, right? Those are your guys that end up being high-round draft picks in the NFL. But Nick Townsend's considered as an aggressive blocker. He's really physical, but we don't know what he has developed in the passing game yet. Right, that still remains to be seen. But they like his athleticism and the raw tools and traits. Shannon, blocker. Michael Masunas, blocker. Charlie Gillette, I don't know what to think. Will Randall, we don't really know what to think of either one of those guys. Nick Townsend. So it's weird that they have to develop more, essentially develop more of these tight ends into being, I think, all-around threats. So you don't have to use them situationally, and you're not predictable based on who you have on the field, because Texas sometimes can be really predictable when they start using their tight ends because their tight ends are so one-dimensional. They don't have a lot of multi-dimensionality with them. That's their biggest issue overall with tight ends. I like their tight ends, but Texas is easy to game plan for when they start getting into 12 personnel, because not all of your tight ends can hurt you in run game and the pass game.
Yeah. CJ, let's start with Nick Townsend, because when you look at the athleticism, just the raw tools, I think he's got the ability, to Rod's point, if he's going to be a Jatavian Sanders, a Gunnar Helm, one of those well-rounded tight ends, if there's going to be one of those guys that emerges from this group, I think it's going to be him. He's the obvious candidate. The question is, how quickly can Jeff Banks expedite his development to where he can be an asset and, to Rod's point, be on the field without it being predictable what you're going to do?
It's basically the biggest question of this room, because, again, to your point, most raw talent of anybody in this room belongs to Nick Townsend. And we saw that obviously playing as much as he did in 2025 as a true freshman. But to your point, Rod, it got very predictable. If he lines out as kind of a slot or outside wide receiver and you see him coming in motion, okay, inside zone is likely to follow because he's just going to come across, kick out the end, and Texas will have to move from there. Well, we saw towards the back end they wanted to include him more, and he only had 3 targets on the season, only 2 receptions. I think it went for about 7 yards total. But Texas gave him 2 rush attempts in the final 2 games of the year, right? He had the kind of the jet sweep or zip sweep or whatever you want to call it against A&M on the goal line, and then he had a short down yard rush attempt against Michigan in the goal in the bowl game. So you sit there and say, okay, they want to include him, but they're not necessarily ready to take off the training wheels, sort of say. So that shows you that they like what they see, but they got to develop and they got to get him where they can utilize and trust him fully. I think that's the big thing, is where's the trust with Nick Townsend? Because obviously they like him enough to go out there and block and be a guy that they can run behind. But in the passing game, is he up to snuff? Is he a guy that they can rely on with Arch's game? Because when you look at it, you are very one-dimensional elsewhere. He is the guy that you can bridge and utilize as a 12 personnel guy that makes defenses respect both the run and the pass. I don't know if you have another option like that at the moment.
Rod, granted, the Texas offense has changed a lot since the 2 guys I'm going to mention were on campus. But when you look at Townsen and Masunis, and I'm including Masunis because that's why you recruited him. You recruited him to be an inline blocker. And with as much wide zone as Texas runs, the tight end becomes really important. With as much split flow as Texas uses in the run game, the tight end becomes really important. Could either one of these guys end up being like a Jeff Swaim or an Andrew Beck, where you're such a good blocker, you're such a good asset that even if it is predictable, you're so good at that one thing that you have to be on the field.
Yeah. Even the NFL recognizes you so damn good. It's like, you know what? You can make an NFL roster because you're just that good at blocking. We appreciate it. No, I mean, I'm hoping that Michael Masunis can be that guy. I think there's a belief that he's got, the mentality that you need, right? You got to take pride in blocking like that too. That he has a tight end, and there's less diva in him. They just have a blue collar mentality that he wants to go out there and impose his will physically. I think that's a little bit part of it because Nick Townsen, remember in Arch, they asked Arch about what people like about Nick Townsen. It's like he's physical. Freshman, he's physical. We were talking to Vic Schaefer, and Vic Schaefer was like, I got to recruit physical. I develop it in my drills, but I got to recruit it. And I think a lot of that, man, that physical mentality, it's got to be, ingrained in you early, especially at the tight end position. And I do think, Texas has had, I don't call them finesse tight ends, but they've been pass first tight ends, the ones that have been really good, like your JT Sanders and your Gunnar Helms. So my hope is that one of the physical elements of your run game will now be your tight ends are more physical. Masunis, and like I said, we know that Nick Townsen is physical. Maybe that's one of your physical edges. I remember them using Nick Townsen. I think he's going to be kind of your cowboy back too. I think there's a cowboy back element to how they use him. Yeah. So his point about how they hand it off to him at times. You see him round up at fullback a few times. So I want to say that that's how they really want to use him, that they can put him in different, sets, whether it be in the backfield or whether it be an H-back or whether it be bring him in motion from the slot because of his athleticism, and they can do all of those different things. So I think right now Nick Townsen and Mike Masunis will make the best match for their 12 personnel. Because remember, there's always a lopsided target share with Texas and their two tight ends.
Yep.
Right? I'll give you here's the target share for the last few years for Texas tight ends. Jack Injuries had 45, and then the next most targets for a tight end was 14 with Jordan Washington. But then last year was 73 and 16, 67 and 17, 72 and 6, 27 and 12. There's a huge difference between the tight end that's going to be featured in the passing game and that other guy. And so I think they want more balance than having that much lopsided. Like I said, that makes you predictable and having, that much of a lopsided focus with their tight end target distribution. Like they should have more balance. And I think, except Michael Masunis, I don't know what he has in the passing game, but I do know, I think Nick Townsen is going to be, ultimately, when he's developed, bring you the best of both worlds is what they would like. A physical blocker, but also a really athletic pass receiver.
Yeah, I didn't want to turn this into a Nick Townsen segment, but CJ, Rod brings up a really good point. We talk about different guys on offense that you can weaponize. Can you weaponize a Michael Terry, a Hollywood Smothers, or Raleek Brown? I think there's something to be said for that for Nick Townsen too, because we have seen him play that sniffer role and get in the backfield and do some other things. Assuming his developmental curve is there as a receiver, he is one of those guys that you can put on the field and move him around and do a lot of different things with him.
Yeah, look, I remember back in his high school recruitment, he took a visit to Texas back into July, going into his senior season, and Jeff Banks was not on campus at the time. I believe he's on a vacation or he was out of town or something. And there were a couple of defensive coaches that came over and said, "Hey, man, if they're not going to prioritize you over at the tight end room, we'll take you as an edge." And then you go watch his edge tape and you say, "Hey, maybe there's something there." So that goes to the athleticism, that goes to the want to at tight end. And I know that we've talked about maybe not having seen Texas have a lot of two-way guys at the tight end spot when it comes to pass receiving out of the backfield and, of course, blocking. Nick Townsen is a guy that the physicality and the want to is there. I wanted to go back just a quick moment to the predictability. And I think going out there and getting Michael Masunis, it kind of stymies that a little bit because, of course, he leans more towards that of an inline run blocker. But 19 receptions for was it about 230 yards, 4 touchdowns? That's a capable guy, right? And he was a number 2 option at the tight end room for Michigan State a year ago, or at least he split probably 55, 45, 50, 50 time in that tight end room as the number 1 piece. I say this because, look, we saw 200 snaps a year ago from Spencer Shannon. You know, he only ran a route 25 times.
Wow.
I was pretty surprised looking at that as well. He was on the field for 123 run blocking opportunities, and then he stayed in pass protection 59 times.
Wow.
So he was a guy when on the field, you didn't have to worry about. And I don't know if that changes going into this year, right? I could be wrong, but knowing what we've seen throughout his career, when he's on the field, I don't necessarily have to account for him in the pattern if I'm a defensive coordinator. So this evens it out for me. Masunas comes in, he could be your inline guy. I'd also look to Nick Townsen as a possible B insert guy. We've seen that in the NFL more with McVay and Shanahan. Yeah. We've seen Sark steal and kind of, copycat a few of those trending pieces in the NFL as well. That's something that I look at and say, okay, how can he become a next level piece for this Texas tight end room? That's something that I look at. Ultimately also growing, kind of the weaponry of that room as a whole as well.
I like that. I like that idea of Townsen maybe becoming Sark's Kyle Juszczyk in his offense. Rod, you mentioned the target share, and that brings me to Emery Winston and Spencer Shannon. There's just haven't been a ton of reps for a number 3 tight end, period. No. So if it is going to be one of those guys that does get the number 3 reps, however many there may be in a given week, do you trust Spencer Shannon as a receiver or Emery Winston as a blocker to come along quicker to get themselves on the field? Because I don't think either guy as is, it's going to be tough for either one of them to get on the field. So either Winston as a blocker or Shannon as a receiver really needs to get on a developmental curve here pretty quick.
That's good.
That's a good
That's
question.
a good one. That's a really good question.
Glad you asked Rod that one.
Man, I ain't gonna lie. That was good. You kind of, I'm stupefied. I would go right now. I put my money on Emery Winston. I've seen Spencer Shannon. They've seen Spencer Shannon. And what was the number, CJ? How often did he go out on the route?
25 times, 0 targets.
So they don't like him out on routes. They don't believe it's something that gives them a personnel advantage. And so I would go with a guy like Emery Winston that he could improve as a blocker. And like I said, a lot of that is, the will, the want to, and then figuring out based on your strength and your size, how to use leverage and hand placement. That's something you can improve on. I'll go with Emery Winston improving on that rather than Spencer Shannon improving as a receiver. But I will say Texas just don't. Yeah, once they get their top 2 tight ends, they cut that rotation. Unless they get into situational stuff in the red zone. We've seen them use some multi-tight end sets, like a 14 personnel package or whatever. But it ain't much room for the 3rd tight end in Sark's offense. You just don't see it. Unless one of those guys, like you said, ends up being a boutique guy. Like if Nick Townsend's not even considered a tight end, he's a cowboy back. They need 2 tight ends. He's a guy, they move all around. They got a special assignments for him. He's one of those guys. Then maybe there is room for a 3rd tight end because he's a different position altogether. Like that's a different discussion though.
And then CJ will wrap it up with Charlie Gillick, a guy they took late in the signing class right before the December signing period. Developmental guy. What do you think is the plan going to be for him in 2026?
Yeah, I would be surprised if it was anything but a red shirt. And I know that he's listed by a couple of recruiting services as around 230 pounds. Look, I saw him in the back end of November when Texas hosted A&M, when Texas hosted Arkansas, and getting to see him in person for the first time, he looked lighter than 230. He looked probably 220, maybe mid 220s. And again, I don't know if that's super significant. He's about to go through, I don't want to say hell, but close to hell with Torrey Beckton, right? This is welcome to college, youngster. So that's going to be the goal. Get his body where it needs to be, or at least close enough to that. Again, I think this is a redshirt opportunity. I think you look at him as a guy that was recruited as a linebacker to UCF, a former wrestler. I think you look at the physicality and say, okay, we like the tools here, right? We like some of the building blocks of being a tight end for our system, but ultimately he's got to get the frame and the weight under control first before I think we see him on the field.
No doubt. It is maybe the most interesting, intriguing / unknown position on offense, talking about the tight ends and what becomes of that group. Really big spring for that group, and we'll be tracking it here at On Texas Football. CJ, Rod, thank you guys for the knowledge and expertise as always. Thank you to Matthew behind the scenes for producing it. For CJ, for Rod, for Matthew, for the entire On Texas Football staff, I'm Jeff Howe. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and until next time.
Welcome.